The first time I met my future son-in-law's parents, they were living in a one-bedroom senior apartment, terrified that their own son would find them. His mother burst into tears the moment I introduced myself. His father gripped my arm so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then he whispered something that made my blood run cold. "Please, don't let your daughter marry him." At that moment, I realized my daughter hadn't been protecting me from an awkward family introduction. She had been protecting a secret, and that secret was about to destroy her life. People often assume retirement is peaceful. For me, it wasn't. At 68 years old, I had learned that losing my wife to cancer was easier than learning to let go of my only daughter. Emily had always been my world. After my wife, Carol, passed away 8 years earlier, Emily and I became a team. We celebrated birthdays together, spent Thanksgiving watching football, argued over who made better apple pie. She called every Sunday without fail, or at least she used to. Everything changed after she met Daniel. At first, I was happy for her. He was polite, successful, confident without appearing arrogant. Emily smiled more than she had in years. As any father would, I wanted to believe she'd found someone who truly loved her. Then the wedding planning began. One evening, she came over carrying a binder full of venue brochures and flower samples. We spent hours laughing over ridiculous centerpiece prices and debating whether anyone actually noticed chair covers. It felt like old times. Then I asked the question every parent eventually asks. "So when do I get to meet Daniel's parents?" The room fell strangely quiet. Emily looked down at her coffee cup. "Oh, you probably won't." I laughed, assuming she was joking. "What do you mean? They're private people." I nodded. "That's fine, we can meet for lunch." She shook her head. "They won't be at the wedding." I blinked. "They're skipping their own son's wedding?" She forced a smile. "They don't like crowds." The answer sounded rehearsed, not convincing, just memorized. I let it go, at least for that evening. Over the next several weeks, I asked the same question in different ways. Every single time, Emily became uncomfortable. Sometimes she'd suddenly remember an appointment. Sometimes she'd change the subject. Once she actually stood up and started washing dishes just to avoid answering. That wasn't my daughter. Emily had never hidden things from me. Not when she wrecked my truck at 17. Not when she dropped out of graduate school for a semester. Not even when she admitted she'd maxed out a credit card years earlier. She always told me the truth. Until now, I began noticing smaller things. Daniel never mentioned his family. Not once. Every story he told involved coworkers, college friends, or business partners. Never his parents. Never siblings. Never childhood memories. Nothing. It was as if his life had begun at 25. One afternoon, I casually asked him where he grew up. He smiled politely. "Oh, here and there." That was it. No town, no school, no details. Just here and there. Driving home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I wasn't looking for perfection. Every family has scars. Mine certainly did. But families don't simply disappear, especially before a wedding. A week later, Emily stopped by to finalize the guest list. I noticed one glaring omission. No names from Daniel's side except a handful of coworkers. No aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no family friends. Nobody. I looked at her. "Emily, are you absolutely sure his parents aren't coming?" She didn't answer. Instead, she quietly packed her papers into the binder. Then she kissed my cheek. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too." She walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned around. "Please," her voice almost cracked, "don't go looking for them." She left before I could respond. I stood alone in my kitchen for a long time. If she had simply said they were estranged, I would have respected it. If she'd told me there had been abuse, I never would have questioned her. But instead, she begged me not to look. And that single sentence convinced me of one thing. Whatever she was hiding, it wasn't over. The very next morning, I opened my laptop. If my daughter couldn't tell me the truth, maybe someone else would. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that went cold long before I took my second sip. I wasn't a detective. I wasn't trying to interfere in my daughter's relationship. I simply wanted answers. If Daniel's parents truly didn't want to attend the wedding, I'd respect their wishes. But Emily's reaction the night before kept replaying in my mind. "Please, don't go looking for them." That wasn't the request of a confident daughter. That was the plea of someone carrying a burden she couldn't explain. I opened my laptop and started with the simplest search I could think of. Daniel's full name. Hundreds of results appeared. Most were useless. Business listings. A LinkedIn profile. Old marathon race times. Nothing about his family. I searched property records next. Growing up in Ohio had taught me one thing. Public records often tell stories people don't. After nearly an hour of searching county databases, I found an address listed under Daniel's parents' names. The property was only 45 minutes from where I lived. A modest ranch-style home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing unusual. I copied the address onto a notepad. For several minutes, I just stared at it. Part of me felt guilty. Emily had asked me not to do this. But another part, the father in me, couldn't ignore the feeling that she wasn't safe. Around noon, I climbed into my pickup truck and headed east. The drive was peaceful. Late autumn had painted the trees in shades of orange and crimson. Families decorated front porches for Thanksgiving. Children rode bicycles through neighborhoods where everyone still waved at passing cars. Everything felt normal. Until I turned onto Daniel's parents' street. The neighborhood itself looked pleasant. Well-kept lawns. Freshly painted fences, American flags fluttering in front yards. Then I saw the house. The grass had grown knee-high. Several shutters hung crooked from the windows. The mailbox leaned at an angle, nearly falling over. A faded for sale sign lay broken beneath a maple tree. No lights, no cars, no signs of life. I parked across the street. Maybe they had moved. Maybe the records were outdated. Still, something about the place felt abandoned rather than simply empty. As I walked toward the front porch, I noticed unopened advertisements scattered near the front door. Weeks' worth of them. I knocked anyway. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. I turned to leave when I heard a voice behind me. "Can I help you?" An elderly woman stood next door holding a small watering can. She looked to be in her late 70s. Friendly, but cautious. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said. "I'm looking for the Wilson family." The smile disappeared from her face. "You know Daniel, I know his fiancé." She lowered the watering can very slowly. "Oh." There was a long silence. Finally, she stepped closer. "You'd better come over here." We sat on 2 old wooden chairs on her front porch. She introduced herself as Margaret. She had lived beside the Wilsons for nearly 30 years. "They were wonderful people," she said quietly, "always helping neighbors, always together." "What happened?" Margaret looked toward the abandoned house. "Their son happened." Those 4 words landed like a punch to my chest. She continued, carefully choosing every word. "I don't know every detail, and I won't pretend I do. But one day ambulances started coming. Police cars came after that." She sighed. "Then debt collectors." I frowned. "Debt collectors?" She nodded. "They lost almost everything." I struggled to process what I was hearing. "Did Daniel do something?" Margaret hesitated. "I never saw it with my own eyes." Then she leaned forward. "But I've lived long enough to recognize heartbreak." She looked directly into mine. I watched those 2 people, aged 10 years in one. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The wind rustled dry leaves across the sidewalk. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. "Do you know where they are now?" Margaret looked around to make sure no one else was listening. Then she reached into her pocket, removed a folded piece of paper, and wrote down an address. "They're living in a senior apartment complex across town." She handed me the note. Before I could thank her, she gently touched my arm. "If your daughter is marrying Daniel," her eyes filled with sadness, "she deserves to hear their side before it's too late." As I walked back toward my truck, I looked once more at the empty house. The silence surrounding it no longer felt mysterious. It felt haunted. And for the first time since Emily announced her engagement, I wasn't wondering whether Daniel was hiding something. I was wondering how terrible the truth had to be for his own parents to disappear from his life completely. The address in my pocket suddenly felt heavier than paper. It felt like the key to a door that once opened could never be closed again. I sat in my truck for nearly 15 minutes before turning the key. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. "Your daughter deserves to hear their side before it's too late." Too late. Those 2 words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. As parents, we spend our entire lives trying to protect our children from scraped knees, broken hearts, and bad decisions. The hardest lesson comes when they're grown. You can't force them to listen. You can only hope they'll trust you before it's too late. The senior apartment complex was only 20 minutes away. It wasn't depressing or neglected. It was clean, modest, and quiet, a place where retired teachers, factory workers, and veterans spent their later years. People walked small dogs. A volunteer helped an elderly man unload groceries. It reminded me of where my wife and I had once talked about moving after retirement. I parked and walked into the lobby. The receptionist smiled politely. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Richard and Linda Wilson." Her smile faded just enough to tell me she recognized the names. "They're expecting someone." "No." I hesitated. "I'm the father of the woman who's about to marry their son." For a brief moment, she simply stared at me. Then she quietly picked up the phone. A minute later, she looked back at me. "They said you can come up." I rode the elevator to the third floor. Apartment 314. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh coffee and laundry detergent. I knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. A woman in her early 70s stood before me. Her silver hair was neatly combed. Her sweater had been mended at one elbow. She looked tired, not physically, emotionally. I'm Frank Harper, I said. My daughter is engaged to Daniel. Before I could say another word, her eyes filled with tears. She covered her mouth with one trembling hand. "Oh, Lord," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The words stunned me. Sorry. For what? She stepped aside without another question. "Please, come in." The apartment was small but spotless. Every piece of furniture looked older than I was. Family photographs covered one wall. Most showed a smiling little boy with bright eyes. Daniel, fishing with his father. Opening Christmas presents. Wearing a Little League uniform. A normal American childhood. Nothing about those pictures matched the image slowly forming in my mind. An older man entered from the kitchen carrying 2 coffee mugs. He stopped the instant he saw me. Linda looked at him. "This is Emily's father." Richard closed his eyes. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, he set the mugs on the table. I was hoping this day would never come. I sat down across from them. "I only came because Emily wouldn't let me meet you." Linda nodded sadly. "We know." "You know," Richard gave a tired smile. "Daniel told her to keep us away." A knot formed in my stomach. "Why?" Neither answered immediately. Linda stood and walked to a small cabinet. She carefully removed a worn photo album. Inside were photographs that looked nothing like the happy family on the wall. Pictures of court documents, bank notices, foreclosure letters, medical bills. Richard slid one paper toward me. "Our retirement account." The balance read, 0. Another document. A home equity loan, signed in their names. Then another. Credit cards, personal loans, collection notices. I looked up in disbelief. "What happened?" Richard answered quietly. "Our son happened." Linda wiped away fresh tears. "We spent years believing we could help him. Every time he got into financial trouble," Richard continued, "we bailed him out. It started small," Linda said. "A missed rent payment, a car loan, then gambling debts." I frowned. "Emily told me Daniel owns a successful consulting business." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "So did he." The room fell silent. Finally, Linda reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "We're not here to stop the wedding because we hate our son." Her voice cracked. "We're here because—" She couldn't finish. Richard did it for her. "Because we don't want another family destroyed." Then Linda stood again. This time she carried over a thin manila folder. She hesitated before placing it in front of me. "If you're going to understand why Daniel hit us," she whispered, "you need to know what he did after he took everything we had." I slowly opened the folder. The very first page made my heart stop. It wasn't another financial record. It was a police report. And my daughter's fiancé was listed as the primary suspect. I stared at the police report without turning the page. For a moment, I honestly wondered if there had been some kind of mistake. Daniel didn't look like a criminal. He was well-dressed, soft-spoken, the kind of young man who held doors open and remembered birthdays. He looked like someone you'd trust with your house keys, not someone whose name appeared at the top of a police report. Richard seemed to read my thoughts. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "Read it." I took a deep breath. The report was nearly 7 years old. It described an investigation involving forged signatures and fraudulent loan applications. Daniel had been questioned after several documents bearing his parents' names were discovered during a bank audit. No charges had been filed. Not because he was innocent, because Richard and Linda had refused to testify. I looked up. "You protected him." Linda nodded, tears already forming again. "He was our son." Richard sighed deeply. "We thought if we kept him out of prison, he'd finally change. Instead, he became smarter, more careful. He learned exactly how far he could go before anyone stopped him," Richard said. "And every time we rescued him, we taught him there would always be another rescue." The words struck me harder than they probably realized. How many parents had made that same mistake, trying so desperately to save a child that they accidentally encouraged the very behavior destroying them? Linda opened another section of the folder. Inside were copies of emails, text messages, handwritten notes. One message caught my attention immediately. It had been sent less than 4 months earlier. From Daniel, to his mother. "If you contact Emily again, you'll regret it." Another, "Stay away from my life." Then another, "She believes me. Don't ruin this." I looked at Linda. "You tried to warn her." She nodded. "Only once." "What happened?" Linda swallowed hard. Emily agreed to meet us. I felt my heart sink. So they did meet. Richard nodded. They met at a little diner outside Columbus. Linda smiled sadly at the memory. She was so polite, so kind, so much like… She stopped herself. So much like what? I asked gently. You. For a second I couldn't speak. Linda continued. We didn't attack Daniel. We didn't ask her to leave him. We simply showed her the truth. She pointed toward the folder, the bank records, the foreclosure documents, the police report, the letters from our attorney. I slowly turned another page. There was even a newspaper clipping about financial fraud investigations involving multiple victims. Daniel's name wasn't printed because no charges had been filed, but the timeline matched perfectly. What did Emily say? I asked. Richard answered. She cried. She believed us. A wave of relief washed over me, until Richard added, for about 2 days. Linda looked toward the window. Then Daniel convinced her we'd fabricated everything. He told her we were abusive parents trying to destroy his happiness. He said the documents were taken out of context. He even claimed we'd stolen money from him years earlier. I shook my head. And she believed him. Linda's voice barely rose above a whisper. People in love often believe the person they fear losing. Nobody spoke for several moments. Outside, I watched an elderly couple slowly walking hand in hand across the courtyard, growing old together, depending on each other, exactly what Richard and Linda should have been doing. Instead, they were living in a small apartment after losing nearly everything they'd spent a lifetime building. Because they trusted their own son. Richard finally broke the silence. We made mistakes too. I looked at him. We ignored warning signs. We excused behavior we should have confronted. We believed love alone could fix what required accountability. There wasn't a trace of bitterness in his voice, only regret. Then Linda reached into the folder one last time. She pulled out a small envelope addressed in Emily's handwriting. We never mailed this back. She handed it to me. It's the letter your daughter wrote us after we met. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The first few lines were filled with compassion. She thanked them for their honesty. She promised to think carefully before making any decisions. Then halfway down the page, the handwriting changed. It became rushed, almost frantic. The final sentence hit me like a freight train. Daniel says people like you know exactly how to manipulate good parents, and I won't let you manipulate my father too. I closed my eyes. That wasn't my daughter's voice. Those were Daniel's words, spoken through her. For the first time since this nightmare began, I understood what had really happened. Daniel hadn't simply lied to Emily. He had slowly isolated her from every person who might challenge his version of the truth. And somehow, I was the last person left standing. I drove home with the folder sitting on the passenger seat. The entire trip I kept glancing at it as though it might suddenly disappear. I wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding, some missing piece that would explain everything. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Richard and Linda hadn't tried to destroy their son's future. They had spent years trying to save him. Now they were trying to save my daughter. The problem was, Emily no longer believed anyone except Daniel. That evening I called her. Can we have dinner tomorrow? She sounded distracted. Sure, Dad. The diner on Maple Street. Okay. When I arrived the next afternoon, she was already there. She smiled the moment she saw me. For just a second, she looked like the little girl who used to wave at me from the school playground. Then reality returned. Wedding magazines covered half the table. Her engagement ring sparkled under the restaurant lights. She looked happy, or at least, she was trying very hard to look happy. We ordered lunch, talked about harmless things. The weather, her job, the honeymoon plans. Neither of us mentioned Daniel. Finally, I reached into my briefcase. I met someone yesterday. Emily froze. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. You, what? I met Daniel's parents. The color drained from her face. For several long seconds, she simply stared at me. You promised. I never promised that. I asked you not to. I know. Tears immediately filled her eyes. You had no right. I had every right. My voice stayed calm. You're my daughter. If something doesn't make sense, I'm going to ask questions. She pushed her plate away. They lied to you. I don't think they did. You don't know them. I spent 3 hours with them. They're manipulative. I slowly placed the folder on the table. They showed me documents. I don't care. Emily, I don't care. Several people glanced toward our booth. She lowered her voice. They've hated Daniel for years. They're trying to ruin our lives. I carefully opened the folder. Just read this. No. Please. No. Emily. She stood so suddenly her chair nearly tipped over. I said no. Her breathing had become uneven, almost panicked. Not angry, afraid. That frightened me more than anything. I looked into my daughter's eyes. Did they show you these papers before? She hesitated, only for a second. But it was enough. You've seen them. She looked away. Daniel explained everything. What did he explain? That they forged documents, that they're obsessed with controlling him, that they're sick. Every answer came instantly, like lines memorized for a play. I quietly asked one final question. If they're lying, why won't you even look at the papers again? She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered something so softly I almost missed it. If I start doubting him, everything falls apart. Those words broke my heart. Because they weren't about Daniel. They were about fear. Fear of admitting she built her future on a lie. Fear of canceling a wedding only weeks away. Fear of telling friends, co-workers, family. Fear of starting over at 34 years old. Daniel hadn't trapped her with chains. He'd trapped her with pride. She picked up her purse. I have to go. Emily. She paused. If you love me, she said quietly, please come to the wedding. I will, but I can't pretend everything is fine. She nodded sadly. I didn't ask you to. Then she walked away. I sat there long after she left. The waitress eventually refilled my coffee without saying a word. Maybe she'd seen conversations like ours before. Parents, children. Love mixed with helplessness. That night my phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice sounded surprisingly calm. I heard you met my parents. I did. I wish you hadn't. So do I. There was a long silence. Then he laughed. Not loudly, not naturally. It was the kind of laugh people use when they're trying to hide anger. You know, he said, Emily trusts me. I know, and she always will. I didn't answer. I hope, he continued, you don't make her choose between us. The line went quiet again. Then he added one final sentence. If you keep interfering, you may lose your daughter forever. He hung up. I sat staring at my phone. For the first time I realized this wasn't simply about stopping a wedding. Daniel wasn't worried I'd expose his past. He was worried I'd break the control he had spent years building. And if I couldn't stop the wedding, then I needed to prepare for what came after it. Because something told me this story wasn't heading toward a celebration. It was heading toward a disaster. The wedding took place on a crisp Saturday afternoon in early November. The venue was an old country estate just outside Columbus. White chairs lined a stone walkway leading to a gazebo draped in autumn flowers. Everything looked perfect. Almost too perfect. Guests laughed over coffee before the ceremony. A string quartet played softly in the background. Photographers hurried from one family to another, capturing smiles that would soon be framed on living room walls. I stood near the entrance adjusting my tie. For a brief moment, I considered getting back into my truck and driving home. Maybe Emily would be happier without my doubts hanging over the day. Then I remembered Richard and Linda, their empty apartment, their trembling voices. Their warning, I couldn't stop the wedding. But I could keep my eyes open. Emily looked beautiful. When she walked down the aisle, every guest stood. For one painful second, I didn't see the woman arguing with me in that diner. I saw my little girl, the 5-year-old who used to dance barefoot in our kitchen while her mother baked cookies. The teenager who cried after failing her first driving test. The young woman who held my hand at Carol's funeral and whispered, "We'll get through this together, Dad." I blinked away the memory before anyone noticed. Daniel stood waiting at the altar. He looked calm, confident. If he felt guilty about anything, he hid it well. The ceremony itself was short. Traditional vows, exchange of rings, a kiss. Applause echoed across the garden. Everyone smiled. Everyone except me. During the cocktail hour, I quietly watched Daniel instead of joining conversations. It didn't take long to notice something strange. Every few minutes he glanced at his phone. Not casually, nervously. Almost as though he were waiting for instructions. At first I told myself I was imagining things. Then his phone buzzed again. He immediately stepped away from a group of guests and disappeared behind the reception hall. 5 minutes later he returned, smiling, laughing, as though nothing had happened. An hour later, he did it again. This time I casually wandered toward the back patio. I wasn't trying to spy. I simply wanted to see who kept pulling the groom away from his own wedding. Before I reached the corner, I heard voices. Daniel wasn't alone. 2 men in expensive suits stood beside him. Neither wore wedding attire. Neither carried a gift. The conversation was quiet, but one sentence reached me clearly. "You promised it'd be handled today." Daniel glanced around before answering. "It will be." One of the men shook his head. "No more delays. I stepped back before they could notice me. When Daniel returned to the reception, his smile seemed almost forced. Emily wrapped her arm around his. He kissed her forehead. Anyone watching would have seen a happy newlywed. I saw a man under pressure. The reception moved inside as evening settled over the estate. Champagne glasses clinked. Guests toasted the bride and groom. Emily laughed more than I had seen in months. For a while, I almost convinced myself Richard and Linda had been wrong. Maybe people really could change. Maybe Daniel had left his past behind. Then during dinner, my phone vibrated. The caller ID surprised me. Richard Wilson. I quietly excused myself and stepped outside. "I'm sorry to bother you," Richard said. "I just wanted to know." His voice faltered. "Is she happy?" I looked through the ballroom windows. Emily was dancing with her new husband. She looked radiant. "Right now," I answered honestly. "She believes she is." There was silence. Then Richard spoke again. "We drove by the venue earlier." My heart tightened. "You what?" "We didn't come inside. Linda didn't think she could bear it." He cleared his throat. "We just wanted to see our son one more time." I turned toward the parking lot. Far beyond the estate entrance sat an old blue sedan. Two figures remained inside, watching from a distance. Not because they weren't invited, because they believed their presence would only hurt the woman they were trying to protect. I stood there for several seconds before walking toward the car. But as I reached the gate, the engine started. The sedan slowly pulled away. Neither Richard nor Linda looked back. I watched the taillights disappear into the night. Behind me, applause erupted inside the ballroom. The first dance had begun. In front of me, two broken parents drove away from their only son's wedding. And somehow, that image hurt more than anything I'd witnessed all day. Still, a feeling deep inside refused to settle. The wedding was over. But whatever those two men had wanted from Daniel, it hadn't ended there. It had only begun. For nearly 3 weeks after the wedding, I heard almost nothing from Emily. That wasn't unusual. Newlyweds deserve their own time. They had taken a short honeymoon in North Carolina, and when they returned, life seemed to settle into a routine. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Every Sunday afternoon, I found myself staring at my phone, waiting for her familiar call. It never came. Instead, I received short text messages. "Busy today." "Talk later, Dad." "Everything's fine." The words felt empty. Emily had never been a woman of few words. Not with me. Then one rainy Tuesday evening, my phone rang. It was nearly 10 o'clock. I answered immediately. "Dad," her voice was shaking. "I need you." Nothing else. Just those 3 words. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the driveway of the townhouse she now shared with Daniel. The front porch light was off. Her car sat crooked in the driveway, as though she'd barely managed to park it. She opened the door before I reached it. The moment I saw her face, I knew she hadn't been sleeping. Mascara streaked her cheeks. Her hands trembled as she stepped aside. Inside the house looked strangely empty. Not physically, emotionally. The television was off. Dinner sat untouched on the kitchen counter. There wasn't a sound anywhere. "Where's Daniel?" I asked. "I don't know." She sat heavily at the dining table. "I haven't seen him since yesterday morning." I remained silent. She reached for a stack of envelopes spread across the table. I thought they were junk mail. She pushed them toward me. They weren't. The first envelope came from a credit card company. The second was from a bank. The third carried the logo of a loan agency, each one addressed to Emily, each one demanding payment. I opened the first statement. "Balance due, $23,000. I frowned. "You never told me you had this card?" "I don't." I picked up another. A personal loan, $48,000. Approved 2 weeks after the wedding. Then another. A home improvement line of credit, $35,000. My heart sank. "Emily, I never applied for any of them." She covered her face with both hands. "They say I signed everything." I carefully examined the documents. The signatures looked convincing, close enough to fool almost anyone. But I had watched Emily sign birthday cards, school forms, and legal papers for over 30 years. Something was wrong. "They forged your signature." She slowly nodded. "I think so." Then she whispered the words I'd been dreading since the day I met Richard and Linda. It happened exactly the way they said it would. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window. Finally, Emily stood and walked to the bedroom. She returned carrying a small metal lockbox. "I found this in Daniel's closet." Inside were photocopies of her driver's license, her social security card, bank account information, insurance paperwork, even old tax returns. Everything someone would need to steal another person's identity. I felt a chill run through me. This wasn't impulsive. It was planned. carefully, methodically. "When did you find this?" I asked. "This afternoon." "And Daniel?" "He texted me this morning." She handed me her phone. The message contained only one sentence. "Don't try to find me." That was it. No explanation. No apology. No goodbye. Just, "Don't try to find me." Emily collapsed into a chair. "I defended him." "I pushed everyone away." "I accused you." Her voice broke. "And his parents." Tears streamed freely down her face. I thought I was protecting the man I loved. I walked around the table and gently placed my hand on her shoulder. "You were protecting the future you believed in." She looked up at me. "I should have listened." "No," she frowned. "You should have been able to trust the man you married." For the first time that night, she cried like my little girl again. Not the confident bride, not the stubborn adult, just a daughter whose heart had been shattered. When she finally calmed down, I reached into my jacket pocket. I still carried Richard's business card. "I think it's time," I said quietly, "that we call two people who have been waiting for this phone call longer than either of us realized." Emily stared at the card for several seconds. Then, with trembling fingers, she nodded. The next morning, Emily and I drove to the senior apartment complex together. Neither of us spoke much during the trip. Some silences don't need to be filled. They carry their own conversations. Emily stared out the passenger window the entire drive. Every now and then she wiped away another tear before I could pretend not to notice. When we pulled into the parking lot, she whispered, "I don't know if they'll even want to see me." I looked at her. If there's one thing I've learned about parents, it's that we rarely stop loving our children. And we don't stop caring about the people our children hurt either. She nodded quietly. Apartment 314 looked exactly the same as it had the week before. I knocked once. Linda opened the door. For a brief second, she smiled when she saw me. Then she noticed Emily standing behind me. The smile disappeared. Not because of anger, because of heartbreak. Emily lowered her head. "I'm so sorry." Before another word could be spoken, Linda stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her. The two women stood in the hallway crying. No accusations, no raised voices, just tears. Richard quietly invited us inside. Nobody mentioned Daniel for several minutes. Instead, Linda made coffee. Richard brought out a plate of homemade oatmeal cookies. It felt strangely ordinary. Exactly the kind of ordinary that families lose after years of pain. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "You told me the truth." Linda nodded. "We tried. I didn't believe you." "We know." Emily reached into her purse and placed several envelopes on the table. The loans. The credit cards. The fake signatures. Richard didn't even look surprised. He simply closed his eyes. "It started exactly the same way with us." Emily began crying again. "I thought I could save him." Richard gave her a gentle smile. "So did we." That sentence seemed to lift a weight from Emily's shoulders. For the first time since this nightmare began, she realized she wasn't the first person Daniel had deceived. She wasn't foolish. She was another victim. After nearly an hour of talking, Richard stood and walked to a filing cabinet. He removed a thick binder. "I've been keeping records for years." Inside were copies of every loan, every forged document, every threatening text, every email, every bank statement, every legal notice. Daniel had left a trail far longer than any of us imagined. "I never threw anything away," Richard said. "I always believed someone might need it someday." That someone turned out to be Emily. Over the next 2 weeks, our lives became consumed with paperwork. We hired an attorney who specialized in financial fraud. Unlike Richard and Linda years earlier, Emily refused to stay silent. She filed police reports, contacted every bank involved, placed fraud alerts on her credit. The attorney encouraged Richard and Linda to reopen their old files as well. One by one, other victims began coming forward. A former business partner, an elderly landlord, a retired couple who had loaned Daniel money after he promised to invest it. Each story sounded painfully familiar. Different faces, same pattern: charm, trust, manipulation, disappearance. The detective assigned to Emily's case eventually called us into his office. Stacks of documents covered his desk. He looked exhausted. "I've been doing this job 22 years, he said. "I've rarely seen someone leave this many victims behind." 3 weeks later, Daniel was arrested at a hotel outside Indianapolis. He had been using another name, another driver's license, another bank account. When the evening news showed the footage, nobody celebrated. Not even Richard. Not even Linda. Certainly not Emily. Justice had finally arrived. But it didn't erase the years that had been stolen. As we stood together outside the courthouse after Daniel's first hearing, reporters shouted questions. None of us answered. Emily slipped her hand into mine. Dad." I looked at her. You were trying to save me all along. I squeezed her hand gently. I never wanted to prove I was right. What did you want? I looked across the courthouse steps where Richard and Linda stood quietly beside each other. I just wanted my daughter to come home. The house felt different after Emily moved back in. Not quieter, not louder, just heavier. She brought only 2 suitcases. The rest of her belongings remained tied up in legal paperwork, while investigators documented everything inside the townhouse. One evening, as I carried her bags to the old guest room, I noticed she had packed almost nothing personal. A few sweaters, family photographs, her mother's quilt, no wedding album, no framed pictures of Daniel, no keepsakes from the honeymoon. It was as though she had already begun erasing a life she desperately wished had never happened. The first few weeks were the hardest. Emily barely slept. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the hallway around 3 in the morning. I'd find her sitting at the kitchen table wrapped in one of Carol's old blankets, staring into a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Neither of us always knew what to say. Sometimes I'd simply sit across from her. 2 cups of coffee. No conversation. Oddly enough, those silent moments seemed to help more than any advice I could have offered. One Sunday afternoon, while cleaning the garage, I found an old cardboard box labeled Emily, age 8. Inside were school drawings, handmade Mother's Day cards, and faded photographs from family vacations. I carried the box into the living room. Emily smiled for the first time in weeks. "My goodness," she whispered, picking up a crayon drawing of our family. "I remember this." In the picture, Carol stood between us holding both our hands. Above our heads, 8-year-old Emily had written in oversized letters, "Home is where we stick together." She stared at the drawing for a long time. Then she quietly began to cry. I forgot who I was. I reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "No, you just trusted the wrong person." She shook her head. "I stopped trusting the right ones." That sentence stayed with me. Because it was true. Daniel hadn't simply lied. He had convinced her that love required cutting herself off from everyone who truly cared about her. A few days later, Emily asked me something I never expected. "Dad, would you go somewhere with me?" "Of course." She looked nervous. "I want to see Richard and Linda." When we arrived at the senior apartment complex, Linda opened the door with the same warm smile she always had. Emily didn't wait to be invited inside. She stepped forward. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness." Her voice trembled. "I know I don't deserve it." Richard walked over slowly. "My dear," he said gently, "that's not how forgiveness works." Emily wiped away fresh tears. "I accused you of lying. I ignored everything you tried to tell me. I even wrote that awful letter." Linda smiled softly. "We kept it." Emily looked horrified. "You did?" Richard nodded. "Not to remind ourselves of the hurt, but to remind ourselves how convincing fear can be." Emily covered her face. "I'm so ashamed." Linda embraced her again. "We're ashamed too." Emily looked confused. "Why? Because we spent years protecting Daniel from consequences," Richard answered quietly. "And by doing that, we unknowingly helped create the man who hurt you." Nobody tried to argue. Nobody tried to decide whose mistakes mattered more. For the first time, everyone simply accepted responsibility for the part they had played. Healing, I realize, begins the moment people stop trying to win and start trying to understand. That afternoon stretched into evening. The 4 of us shared a simple dinner of homemade soup sandwiches and apple pie. Nothing fancy. Just ordinary food around an ordinary table. Yet somehow, it felt more like family than the wedding reception ever had. As we drove home, Emily looked out the window and smiled through her tears. "Dad?" "Yes, I finally understand something." "What is it?" "The people I thought were trying to ruin my future," she paused, "were actually trying to save it." I glanced at my daughter, and for the first time in many months, I saw hope replacing regret. Maybe the deepest wounds never disappear completely, but they can become the very places where wisdom begins to grow. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year. The maple tree in my front yard, which had looked lifeless all winter, slowly filled with bright green leaves. Watching it reminded me of something Carol used to say. The hardest winters often grow the strongest springs. At the time, I thought she was talking about weather. Now I understood she had been talking about people. Nearly 9 months had passed since Daniel's arrest. His case never went to trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence from banks, victims, forensic accountants, and investigators, he accepted a plea agreement. The judge sentenced him to prison and ordered restitution that would likely take decades to repay. When the hearing ended, no one cheered. Justice isn't the same as happiness. It simply marks the place where healing is finally allowed to begin. Emily never attended another court appearance after that first hearing. She had seen enough. She didn't need revenge. She needed peace. Slowly, life found its rhythm again. She returned to work, started seeing old friends she hadn't spoken to in years. One Sunday, she even laughed so hard during dinner that she accidentally spilled iced tea across my table. For the first time since Carol passed away, the house sounded like a home again. A few weeks later, Emily surprised me with another request. "Dad, I'd like to invite Richard and Linda over. They've spent enough holidays alone." I smiled. "I think your mother would have liked that." On a warm Sunday afternoon, they arrived carrying nothing more than a homemade peach cobbler. We grilled hamburgers in the backyard, talked about baseball, argued over whether old cars were built better than new ones. Richard told stories about working 35 years at a paper mill. Linda laughed about Daniel's childhood before everything changed. Not to excuse him, simply to remember that once, he had been an innocent little boy too. That may have been the saddest lesson of all. Very few people are born determined to hurt others. Sometimes years of poor choices, ignored warning signs, and misplaced mercy slowly shape someone into a stranger. As the sun began to set, Emily stood and gently tapped her glass. "I want to say something." The backyard grew quiet. She looked first at Richard and Linda, then at me. "I spent a long time believing love meant defending someone no matter what." She paused. "I was wrong." She turned toward me. "Dad, you never stopped loving me, even when I stopped listening." Then she looked at Richard and Linda. "And you never stopped trying to protect someone who wasn't even your daughter." Tears glistened in Linda's eyes. Emily continued, "I can't change the choices I made. I can't undo the hurt, but I can spend the rest of my life making different choices." No one applauded. No one needed to. Some moments are too honest for applause. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Emily and I stood on the back porch watching fireflies drift across the yard. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think strength meant never admitting I was wrong." I smiled. "What do you think now?" "I think real strength is having the courage to come back and thank the people who never gave up on you." I looked up at the stars. For the first time in a very long time, I felt Carol's absence a little less painfully. Not because I missed her less, but because the family we built together had somehow survived its darkest chapter. Life doesn't always give us the ending we planned. Sometimes it gives us something better, a second chance, not to erase the past, but to learn from it. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to call someone who has always loved you, even if pride has kept you apart. And if you've ever been the parent, grandparent, or friend who kept loving someone through their worst mistakes, know that your patience matters more than you may ever realize. If you'd like to hear more stories about family forgiveness and finding hope after heartbreak, I'd be honored if you shared this story with someone who needs it and subscribe for more. The end.